The psychic scream that tore through the Sanctum Imperialis made no sound in the vibrating air, but it shattered the minds of the weaker astropaths like dry twigs snapping in a galactic gale. For 10,000 years, the Golden Throne had been the sun around which our entire species revolved, a mechanical star that burned with the souls of the innocent and the iron will of a carrion god. It was the only constant in a universe of infinite madness, the lighthouse that kept the demons at bay. But in the span of a single, terrifying heartbeat, the unthinkable became reality. The light went out. It did not fade gradually like a dying ember in a cooling hearth. It was extinguished with the violence of a candle snuffing out in a hard vacuum. One moment the air was thick with the golden, radioactive taste of divinity, a heavy, metallic tang that coated the back of the throat and made your teeth ache with the pressure of the warp being held back. The next, we were plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt like being buried alive in a tomb of ice miles beneath the earth. I dropped my hydro spanner into the sludge of the coolant river, the heavy tools splashing into the toxic liquid, but I barely heard it over the sudden, thundering silence. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone, as I realized with a sickening lurch of my stomach that the hum of the universe had stopped. The great atmospheric cyclers, machines the size of hive cities that recycled the stagnant, incense-choked air of the palace, ground to a halt. The chanting of the tech thralls, a binary drone of data worship that had not ceased for millennia, died in their throats. The only sound left in the cavern was the cooling metal of a god's life support system ticking as it died, contracting in the sudden, terrible cold. My name is Karn, and I am a dredger of the third cycle, a man whose entire existence is measured in the rhythmic scraping of sludge from the sub-pits beneath the Eternity Gate. For 20 years, I have lived in the sweating, steaming guts of the machine, a place where the heat is enough to blister skin, and the noise is a constant, physical assault that rattles the teeth. We are the invisible millions, the biological fuel that keeps the engine running, taught from birth by the electro-whips of the overseers that if we stop, the Emperor dies, and if the Emperor dies, humanity falls. But now the heat was fading, replaced by a grave chill that seeped into the marrow. The noise was gone, the sweat on my brow turned cold in an instant. I looked up through the tangled web of Gothic scaffolding, hissing pipes, and hanging bundles of nerve cabling, committing the ultimate sin of raising my eyes to the high dais. What I saw froze the blood in my veins. The mountain of machinery that was the Golden Throne sat silent, stripped of its blinding halo. Without the golden fire that usually seared the retinas of anyone foolish enough to look, it looked small. It looked like a cage built for a beast, not a throne built for a king. And sitting upon it was not a god, but a corpse. He was a withered thing, a husk of dried bone and parchment skin, wrapped in tattered cables and sobbing wires that no longer hummed with power. His head was bowed against his chest, a posture of final, crushing defeat. The golden armor that history said shone like the sun was dull, covered in the gray dust of 10,000 years of stagnation. The realization hit me, and it hit every other soul in that room at the same instant, a collective psychic shockwave. The beacon was out. The Astronomican was dead. The fleets in the warp were blind, drifting in the predator-haunted dark. We were alone, and the wolves were scratching at the door. Near me, Magos Prime Hestia, a creature of red robes and brass mechadendrites who had supervised this sector for 3 centuries, collapsed. Her mechanical limbs went limp, clattering against the grating with the sound of spilled coins. Oil leaked from her optical lenses like black tears. She whispered that the logic was broken, that the Omnissiah had disconnected, and that the cycle was complete. Her voice, usually a synthesized monotone of perfect calculation, cracked with a despair that was terrifyingly human. Panic began to ripple through the sub-pit, a contagion of madness spreading faster than any plague. Men and women who had known only duty began to scream, tearing at their faces and clawing at the blast doors. Desperate to escape a tomb that was rapidly running out of air. They trampled one another in the dark, their faith shattering along with the machinery, acting on the primal instinct of rats on a sinking ship. But then, a vibration cut through the hysteria. It was not a siren, it was not an explosion, it was a tremor. It started deep within the earth, vibrating through the soles of my boots, a heavy, tectonic impact that shook dust from the ceiling miles above. The screaming stopped. The weeping tech priests froze, their logic cores unable to process the data. We all turned back to the dais, eyes wide in the gloom. The silence stretched, agonizing and thick, until the tremor came again. It was stronger this time. A ripple appeared in the pool of coolant sludge at my feet, concentric rings spreading out from the center, disturbing the oil-slick surface. It wasn't an earthquake, it was a heartbeat. But no human heart could beat with that force. It was the rhythm of a planet's core shifting, the sound of a star trying to ignite in the center of a black hole. High above, the massive feed cables connected to the Emperor's skull began to twitch. They didn't spark with the clean, golden energy of the throne. They pulsed with a raw, visceral red light, like veins filling with fresh blood. The vibration became deafening now, a drum of war beating inside the chest of the world. I watched, breath held in a chest that felt too tight, as the withered hand of the corpse god moved. It was a jerky, spasmodic motion, the movement of a marionette waking up in a nightmare. The dry, gray skin on his fingers cracked and fell away like ash. Beneath it, I saw new flesh. It was pink, raw, and terrifyingly healthy. It knit together before our eyes, muscle fibers weaving themselves over ancient bone, tendons snapping into place with the tension of steel cables. The blackened ribcage heaved, taking in a breath that sucked the vacuum from the room, an inhalation so powerful it made the heavy velvet banners in the hall flutter as if caught in a sudden storm. The custards, the golden giants who stood eternal watch, took a unified step back. For 10,000 years, they had guarded a relic, a silent idol to whom they had pledged their lives. Now they were facing a resurrection. One of them, a shield captain whose armor was etched with the names of 1,000 victories, lowered his spear, his post-human composure shattering. He whispered a question to his king, his voice trembling with a mix of hope and terror, but the words were lost in the rising wind. The Emperor did not answer with words, he answered with fire. A wave of heat washed over us, incinerating the chill of the dead throne. It wasn't the radioactive burn of a reactor, it was the searing, blinding heat of a desert sun at noon. The darkness in the room was banished, scoured away by a light that radiated from the figure on the throne. But this was not the cold, distant light of the Astronomican we had worshipped. This was fierce. It was angry. It was the light of a warlord who had woken to find his kingdom in ruins. The last of the withered skin on his face burned away, revealing features that were stern, noble, and terrifyingly perfect. His eyes, empty sockets for an eternity, snapped open. They were not glowing orbs of energy. They were brown, deep human, and filled with an intelligence that spanned eons. He looked out over the sanctum, over the kneeling custards, over the weeping tech priests, and finally, down into the pit where I stood covered in filth. He saw me. He saw all of us, and in that gaze there was no mercy, there was only judgment. He stood up. The cables tore away from his spine, sparking and flailing like dying snakes. The golden throne, the life support system that had kept him prisoner, groaned and died, rendered obsolete in a single motion. He stood tall, clad in golden armor that seemed to repair itself as we watched, the dents and scratches of the Horus heresy flowing back into smooth perfection. He took a step forward, and the impact was like a thunderclap that signaled the end of the age of stagnation. The corpse god was gone, the master of mankind had returned. And as I fell to my knees, weeping not from fear, but from the sheer, crushing weight of his presence, I realized that the galaxy wasn't ready. The king was awake, and he was furious. The silence that followed the resurrection was a physical weight that pressed the air from my lungs and pinned me to the cold iron of the sub-pit floor. For 10,000 years, the Sanctum Imperialis had been a cathedral of deafening industry. a place where gears screamed and steam hissed in eternal service to a dying god. Now the only sound was the terrified, ragged breathing of the thousands of souls who had witnessed the impossible, a collective gasp of awe that tasted of copper and ozone. I pressed myself flat against the grating, the toxic coolant sludge soaking into my rough-spun robes, terrified that even the frantic beating of my own heart would draw the gaze of the golden giant who stood upon the dais. He did not look like the benevolent, distant father the Ecclesiarchy preached about in the sermons. He looked like a force of nature that had been caged for too long, and now that the bars were broken, he was looking for something to burn. The Captain General of the Custards, a warrior whose name was etched onto the walls of the palace and who had stood vigil for centuries without flinching, took a hesitant step forward. His auramite armor, usually a symbol of unshakable authority and martial perfection, seemed thin and fragile in the presence of his creator, like tin foil before a blast furnace. He lowered his guardian's spear, the tip scraping against the stone, and bowed his head not in the ritualistic reverence of a guard, but in the primal submission of a son facing a father he thought was lost to the void. The Emperor did not acknowledge him with a word or a touch. The master of mankind simply walked past the kneeling demigod, his golden boots striking the dais, steps with a heavy, deliberate cadence that sent vibrations through the floor and into the marrow of my bones. He descended the pyramid of machinery, his eyes scanning the room with a cold, analytical precision that seemed to dissect the very atomic structure of the air. He looked at the weeping tech priests who were convulsing in binary prayer, their logic circuits overloaded by the impossibility of the moment. He looked at the terrified thralls huddling in the shadows, clinging to their tools as if they were talismans. He looked at the decaying, Gothic grandeur of the throne room itself, at the skulls etched into every surface, the dust of martyrs that coated the floor. His expression was not one of joy or relief. It was a look of profound, simmering disgust, the look of a master architect returning to find his masterpiece covered in filth and superstition. The light that radiated from him was not the soft, golden halo of the icons. It was a harsh, revealing glare that exposed every crack in the marble and every flaw in the system. He stopped at the edge of the dais, where the high altar met the grime of the lower decks. From the shadows of the nave, a high priest of the Ecclesiarchy scrambled forward, a man draped in silk robes so heavy with gold thread and jewels that he could barely stand upright. He was shouting prayers in high Gothic, his voice cracking with hysteria, proclaiming this moment a divine miracle of the God Emperor and calling for the faithful to rejoice. He threw himself at the Emperor's feet, clutching at the hem of the golden cloak with trembling, manic hands, weeping tears of joyous fanaticism. The Emperor looked down at the priest, and for a moment, the temperature in the room spiked so drastically that the coolant pools around me began to steam. He spoke a single word, commanding the priest to cease. The word was not shouted, yet it hit the room with the force of an orbital bombardment. It was a command that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the biological instinct to obey. The priest froze instantly, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as the air was sucked out of his lungs. The Emperor did not reach down to help the man up. He simply looked at the gold-embroidered symbols on the priest's robes, the aquilars, the skulls, the icons of a god, and his lip curled in a sneer of contempt. He told the priest that he wore the symbols of his face, but spoke the words of a stranger. He asked who he was to worship him when he had built a temple on a foundation of lies. The voice was resonant, metallic, and perfect, like the striking of a bell that signaled the end of time. The priest stammered, unable to comprehend that his God was rejecting him. He tried to quote scripture, to recite the Lectitio Divinitatis, but the words turned to ash in his mouth. The Emperor waved a hand, a casual gesture of dismissal that sent an invisible wall of psychic pressure slamming into the priest. The man was thrown backward, sliding across the polished floor until he hit the base of a pillar, silenced not by death, but by the sheer, crushing weight of the Emperor's will. The Golden King turned his back on the priest and looked up at the massive banners hanging from the ceiling, banners that depicted him as a holy warrior surrounded by halos of light. These were tapestries woven from the hair of saints, artifacts that people had died to protect. He reached out a hand, and the fabric ignited. There was no spark, no fuel, just the sudden, violent application of his mind. The banners burned in seconds, turning to ash that rained down upon us like grey snow. He was burning his own legend. He was destroying the myth to make room for the man. From my hiding spot in the sludge, I felt a tear track through the grime on my cheek. Everything I had been taught, every sermon, every prayer, every moment of suffering I had endured for the God Emperor was being dismantled before my eyes. He wasn't a god. He was something far more terrifying. He was a warlord. And as he turned his burning gaze toward the massive blast doors that led to the rest of the palace, I knew that the silence of the last 10,000 years was over. The galaxy was about to hear him scream. The massive Eternity Gate, a barrier of adamantium and ceramite that had stood shut against the horrors of the galaxy for 10,000 years, began to tremble. It was not the mechanical shudder of gears turning or pistons firing. It was a vibration of submission, as if the very metal of the palace recognized the hand of its architect and was desperate to yield. I scrambled out of the coolant pit, my boots slipping on the slick, black grease of the floor, and pressed myself into the shadows of a massive support pillar, terrified yet unable to look away. The Emperor walked toward the gate not as a man approaches a door, but as a storm approaches a coast. He did not slow down, he did not gesture. He simply walked, and the massive doors, heavy enough to withstand an orbital bombardment, groaned in protest and began to swing outward, pushed open by the sheer, crushing pressure of his psychic will. As the gap widened, a stale, recycled wind from the outer palace rushed into the sanctum, carrying with it the sense of a rotting empire, incense, unwashed bodies, fear, and the metallic tang of blood. The Emperor stepped across the threshold, and for the first time in millennia, the master of mankind left his prison. The custards, the 10,000 who had stood vigil in the dark, fell into formation behind him. They moved with a fluidity that was terrifying to behold, their golden armor chiming softly as they adjusted their grip on their guardian spears, their faces hidden behind masks of impassive auramite. They were no longer jailers guarding a corpse. They were a legion marching to war, and their shame at the state of the Imperium radiated from them in waves of cold, silent fury. I followed. It was madness, a heresy that would see me executed 1,000 times over, but I was caught in the wake of the Emperor's presence like a leaf caught in a hurricane. I scurried through the maintenance gantries and service tunnels that ran parallel to the processional way, breathing in the dust of centuries, watching through the grates as the Golden King witnessed what his dream had become. The Hall of Glories stretched out before him, a canyon of marble and gold that went on for kilometers. But it was not the hall of science and reason he had built. It was a carnival of superstition. Every inch of the walls was covered in purity seals, prayer scrolls, and the skulls of martyrs etched with gold. Floating cherubs, lobotomized vat-grown babies with cybernetic wings, flitted through the air, swinging censers of choking smoke. Servo skulls, the severed heads of loyal servants kept alive by crude machinery, chattered binary prayers from the shadows. The Emperor stopped. He looked up at a statue of himself that towered 100 meters high. In the stone carving, he was depicted not as a man or a warrior, but as a weeping god, surrounded by haloed saints and pleading sinners. The statue held a book of scripture in one hand and a sword of judgment in the other. It was a lie carved in mountain stone. The air around the Emperor began to distort, shimmering with heat. He looked at the cherubs fluttering above him, these grotesque mockeries of life that the Ecclesiarchy called holy. One of the creatures, sensing the power radiating from him, flew closer, its dead, glass eyes clicking as it scanned his face. It let out a pre-recorded hymn, a high-pitched, electronic wail of praise, The emperor did not touch it, he merely looked at it. The cherub ceased to exist. It didn't explode, it simply unraveled, its meat and metal disintegrating into atomic dust in a fraction of a second, erased from reality by a thought of pure disgust. The other cherubs in the hall, sensing the sudden vacuum, scattered into the darkness, their mechanical wings beating frantically against the stagnant air. He whispered the word sickness. The word echoed down the length of the hall, louder than any shout. He told the empty air that they had turned his house into a tomb for the sane. He continued walking, his pace accelerating. He passed a squad of palace guard, mortal men and women in ceremonial armor who were stationed at the intersection of the halls. As they saw him, the living legend, the myth made flesh, they did not cheer, they broke. Minds that had been conditioned to worship a distant, silent god could not comprehend the reality of a furious, living man. They fell to their knees, some weeping, some catatonic, their weapons clattering to the floor. The emperor did not look at them. He looked past them, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon of the palace walls. He wasn't looking at the soldiers, he was looking at the sky. He could feel what we could not. He could feel the great rift splitting the galaxy in two. He could feel the chaos gods laughing in the warp. He could feel the rot in the very soul of his species. Blocking the path at the end of the Hall of Glories stood the High Lords of Terra. They had been summoned by the alarms, a dozen of the most powerful individuals in the galaxy, draped in robes of office that cost more than planets. They stood with their personal guards, a wall of political power and military might. They looked prepared to negotiate, to debrief, to handle the situation of the throne failing. But as the emperor emerged from the smoke of the burning banners, glowing with the light of a contained sun, the High Lords realized their mistake. You do not negotiate with gravity. You do not debrief a storm. The emperor stopped 10 paces from them. He looked at the fabricator general of Mars, a massive centaur-like machine creature of brass and pistons. He looked at the master of the administratum, a withered man holding a staff of office who had condemned billions to starvation with a stroke of a pen. He looked at them not as his counsel, but as the parasites that had been feeding on his corpse. The silence that stretched between them was the silence of a guillotine blade hanging at the top of its arc. The emperor took one step forward, and the High Lords of Terra, the rulers of 1,000,000 worlds, flinched. The fabricator general was the first to speak, his voice a grinder of scrap code and static that grated against the marble walls. He stammered that the Omnissiah's return was illogical, a deviation from the prophecy of the machine god. He demanded data, verification, a reason for the interruption of the holy cycle. The emperor did not blink. He looked at the machine man, a creature who had replaced so much of his biology with steel that he had forgotten what it felt like to bleed. The emperor told him that he looked for a god in the gears because he was too weak to trust in his own flesh. The psychic pressure in the hall intensified, creating a ringing in our ears. The fabricator general's mechadendrites seized up, sparks showering from his joints as his internal logic engines were overwhelmed by the sheer presence of the master of mankind. The master of the administratum stepped forward next, clutching a scroll of laws that predated his own great-grandfather. He spoke of protocols, of the Lex Imperialis, of the chain of command that had held the Imperium together for 10 millennia. He tried to cite the law to the man who wrote it. The emperor laughed. It was a dry, terrible sound, devoid of humor. He asked them if they thought his silence was permission. He asked them if they thought his patience was approval. He told them that while he sat in the dark, holding the gate against hell, they had grown fat on the fear of his people. He told them that their administration was over. He did not raise a weapon. He simply walked through them. The force of his movement pushed the High Lords aside like dry leaves in a gale. They were not executed. They were ignored, rendered instantly irrelevant by the return of the only authority that mattered. As he passed, the golden aquilars on their staffs of office tarnished and turned gray, a physical manifestation of their loss of mandate. He reached the ultimate wall, the outer battlement of the Imperial Palace that overlooked the wasted landscape of Holy Terra. The wind here was harsh, stripping away the incense of the inner sanctum and replacing it with the radioactive dust of the throne world. I watched from a ventilation grate as the Emperor walked to the edge of the precipice and looked up. For 10,000 years, he had fought the war in the warp with his mind, a psychic wrestling match against 4 gods of chaos. Now he looked at the physical scar that tore the galaxy in half, the cicatrix maledictum, the Great Rift, a purple bruise across the night sky where reality had bled out. The sight of it would have driven a lesser man to despair. It was a sign of absolute failure, a testament to the fact that while he slept, the enemy had won. But the Emperor did not despair. He calculated. I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten. I could feel the change in the air pressure as his mind reached out, not to the Astronomican, but beyond it. He was not trying to relight the beacon, he was becoming the beacon. The golden light that surrounded him flared outward, shooting up into the stratosphere like a reverse lightning bolt. It punched through the clouds, through the pollution, and into the void. It didn't just illuminate the dark, it burned it back. The purple bruise of the rift seemed to recoil, the chaos energies sizzling as they came into contact with the raw, ordered might of the anathema. The light spread across the planet, touching the minds of every living soul on Terra. To the faithful, it felt like a warm hand on the shoulder. To the heretic, it felt like the onset of a fever. He turned to the Captain General of the Custards, who had followed him to the wall, standing a respectful distance away. The Emperor's voice was calm now, the calm of a general who has surveyed the battlefield and found it wanting, but not impossible. He told the captain to open the vaults. He told him to unlock the dark cells. He said that the time for hiding was over. He said that they would not defend anymore. He looked at the sky, at the bleeding wound in the galaxy, and his eyes burned with a cold, terrifying resolve. He said that the long war was ending and the Great Crusade was beginning again. He turned back toward the palace, and for a fleeting second, his gaze swept over the ventilation grate where I was hiding. I froze, expecting death, expecting to be unmade like the cherub, but he did not kill me, he nodded. A barely perceptible inclination of his head, acknowledging the witness in the walls. In that moment, Karn the Dredger died. The fear, the grime, the smallness of my life evaporated. I had seen the king wake. I had seen the false idols burn. I scrambled back down into the darkness, not to hide, but to work. The engines would need to run hotter than they ever had before. The fleets would need fuel. The armies would need weapons. The Golden King was awake, and he had promised us a war that would set the stars on fire. I picked up my hydrospanner from the sludge. The silence was gone. The heartbeat of the world had returned, and it sounded like the marching of a billion boots.